Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler and today I want to talk to you about David Gemmell and his debut novel, which is called Legend, from 1984. David Gemmell was English. He was born in London in 1948. He died in 2006 at the end of July. His second wife, Stella, found him in the morning of the 28th of July 2006 dead in front of his computer. He had died while working on the final book in a new trilogy about the legend of Troy. And this, I think, is the most beautiful way in which a writer can die in writing his works. David Gemmell grew up in London with a single mother until he was 6 years old. He had a very tough childhood. There was a lot of bullying, a lot of fighting, and then the stepfather, Bill Woodward, came into his life, and he encouraged Gemmell to take up boxing to be able to defend himself. And this proved to be very influential, not just on Gemmell's life, but also on his future writing. Gemmell worked for some years as a journalist. He was actually fired in 1986 from his job as a journalist after having used some of his colleagues' name in his third novel, Woodward. After that he became a full-time writer, concentrating on writing. He published more than 30 novels, mainly in the genre of heroic fantasy. All of them became bestsellers except one, and his favorite book was actually his first novel, Legend. And the book tells the story about a siege of a fortress. David Gemmell started writing this book in 1976 after having been diagnosed with cancer, which he believed to be terminal. And the book is symbolic. The fortress is himself. The invaders trying to take the fortress is his cancer, and he left the ending open initially, waiting for the results from his examinations, medical examinations, whether he was going to die or not. He believed he was going to die. A lot of the heroes in David Gemmell's works are based on his stepfather, Bill Woodward. And so also in this book, Legend, which tells the story of an old warrior, Druss, who is the legend, who is persuaded to go back into fighting in leading the defense of this fortress. Typical themes in David Gemmell's works are honor and loyalty, military virtue, but also growing old, and also that of redemption. David Gemmell was a Christian, and he saw his own works as Christian books. So there's a lot of violence in the books, but David Gemmell also was keen to restrict the violence and to give it a useful function in the stories. There's not violence for violence sake. There is violence because it's necessary, simply. After his death, 2 years later, in 2008, the David Gemmell Legend Award was established, led by a committee of 18 writers, headed by Stan Nichols, who is also a fantasy writer, who has written a few very influential books about orcs, which started this series of books about different fantasy races, also here in Germany. Elves, for example, dwarves, and others, trolls, and there are a lot of such books and series. David Gemmell was inspired by the life of William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter, and also by classical westerns. He loved the movie High Noon, for example. He loved John Wayne movies. And now we're going to delve into this book, Legend by David Gemmell. Feel free to give me your comments in the comment section, to subscribe and to give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you in my next video. The subject of the book. An aged hero grudgingly accepts one last mission at the request of people who need him. Has been told countless times, but it doesn't bother that much. What is worse is the lack of realism. A prince sends his only daughter alone through a forest full of robbers to deliver an important message to the abbot of a monastery. Throughout the book, she is completely fearless, although constantly risking her life. Druss himself, the main character, is introduced almost 50 pages into the story. It's a pity that Druss, although 60 years old, has to prove himself like an insecure teenager, and it's never clear what he lives for after his wife died. Except for drinking, there is no joy in his life, and he has even lost his interest in women. The characters all have their flaws, but there is no real depth to their psychology, and the reader gets the feeling that the author has consciously provided each character with a flaw just to make them come alive. One of them is an albino, but it's of no importance to the story. There are too many characters, which means that we don't really get to know most of them. Gemmell gives a fairly realistic description of medieval warfare in all its ugliness, the dirt, the flies, the stench, and so on. But the fights are too long to be believable, a common problem in fantasy fiction. And although taking place in a medieval world, as usual in the genre, some things seem very modern. There is talk about cancer and atoms, people use paper to write messages, and doctors wear white coats. Characters from Greek mythology like centaurs and Amazons are mentioned, and so is the devil. The magic is boring and fairly uninspired, and we are not told where it comes from, for example, if it's of divine origin or not. Too much time passes during the siege. It's unlikely that defenders would be able to endure such attacks for 10 weeks, and one wonders what is happening in the meantime. A girl falls in love with Druss, and you experience her perspective, but later there is hardly any mention of her. Druss is on the brink of a physical breakdown already after one day of fighting, and the girl who takes care of him tells him that he will not survive another day of combat without a day of rest. He ignores her advice, but 10 weeks later he is still fighting. Such a central character as Virai, the prince's daughter, disappears into the background, and, surprisingly, Druss does as well. Gemmell makes some beginner's mistakes in his debut novel. There is too much description, especially at the beginning of the book, like of clothes or of someone building a fire, and there are too many adjectives. The text is somewhat repetitive. The word sky appears 3 times on 9 lines, on page 278, for example. A major problem is the very abrupt change of perspective within a chapter, even without a space to mark a new section. And there are sudden time jumps. Further, Gemmell switches back and forth between the authoritarian and the personal narrative perspective, which further impairs the reading flow. The all-knowing narrator tells us a few things about the characters instead of showing them. For example, that a young woman feels insecure among men. But we never experience her reaction. Surprisingly, the narrative tone is sometimes sentimental, especially the love story, but also a few things uttered by other characters. Some of the dialogues feel unnecessary, since they do not drive the events forward. With a character like Druss, an old but very experienced and still very powerful warrior, who has lost his belief in what he once lived and fought for, Gemmell could have done so much more. A spark of philosophical wisdom would have vastly improved on the character as well as on the story.